So my name is Kerri Gaskin. I am a therapist here in Riverview, New Brunswick. We are for this series of CBT Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Coping Skills for Anxiety. Session 4 is all about cognitive therapy skills. In session 1, we covered anxiety vulnerability management, or Anxiety 101. In session 2, we talked about relaxation and mindfulness. And in session 3, last week, we talked about exposure and desensitization, how to avoid avoidance, how our behaviors can make anxiety worse, and in some of the surprising ways in which we learn to manage our anxiety, which aren't always healthy ways. So here we are, week 4, learning how to use those cognitive therapy skills and how we're going to put everything all together. Every action has a thought connected to it. So in today's sessions, we're going to be exploring our thoughts, explaining how they are closely linked to our emotions. We're going to discuss how to identify, how to understand, and how to respond to our thoughts as a way to help us feel better. We're going to be figuring out how to identify the thoughts that are troubling us, how to understand them as well as we possibly can, and we're going to learn, pardon me, I just need to put my notes up on a higher platform. And we're going to learn how to respond to our thoughts by really gathering appropriate evidence in order to see a situation as realistically as possible and in as detailed a way as possible. When we've done that, we will then have a better idea of the two kinds of thoughts that we have, or the kinds of thoughts that are associated with two different kinds of anxiety. The first is what we call the fear of fear, which is really our fear of anxiety itself. And that's typically associated with panic disorder, but it is a common part of all disorders. And then worry, which is often a part of what we call generalized anxiety disorder, but also is a common part of all anxiety issues. So we're going to be delving into those things today. So if we think about previous sessions, we may remember that thoughts, behaviors, and emotions all influence one another. And cognitive is simply a fancier word to describe anything related to thoughts, to the things that happen in our brain. And in this session today, we're going to explore how our thoughts can lead to negative emotions and what we can actually do about it. So cognitive therapy skills involve responding to and modifying our thoughts to help us cope better in our daily lives, to help us feel less anxious. So really, what we need to think about is the main goal of cognitive therapy or cognitive skills being to gather evidence, to be like a detective, to uncover facts about what has actually happened, something that has happened in the past or is happening right now. And by examining our thoughts, by examining our beliefs, our basic assumptions in great detail, we learn to make informed choices about the issues that are impacting us in either positive or negative ways. So for example, we may, when we examine it, discover that a thought is not entirely true, that it's not completely true. And this can help us decrease our efforts to be protective. Remember, we talked about safety behaviors? It decreases our efforts to protect ourselves and lowers our anxiety. And another option that we have is to take these facts and do something with them. For example, problem solve. So we finally may find that these facts help us understand that nothing can be done to change a situation. Sometimes we really need to recognize that, and we work to accept that and let go of our efforts to control everything around us. And in order to choose one of these particular options, we're going to use a set of cognitive skills to help understand our thoughts and our situations and what the possibilities for them are. It's really hot. It's all about the mint and the cucumber today. It's just one of those, it's already like 36 degrees down here. So when we're looking at examining the evidence, and I love the idea of detectives, as you know, I've talked about this before. But when we really think about it, we want to ask some very specific questions. Scientists and detectives are really good at asking the right kinds of questions to better understand situations, right? And when we really develop our own cognitive skills, we begin to understand and to know which questions to ask to best explain any anxiety-producing situation. So for example, we might ask, what is the likelihood that this anxiety-producing event will actually happen? If the event were to happen, would something bad happened? Would it be tragic? What would I do if something bad happened? How could I handle it? You know, is there another explanation to account for what has happened? Do I know all of the facts of the situation? So we start to ask ourselves some very specific questions to dig in to our feelings. Now, some people have the notion that cognitive therapy skills are just about thinking positively, just being positive. And in fact, it's not just about thinking positively. It's about thinking accurately. So while it is important to recognize that being aware of the positives is an important part of CBT, we also want to gather all of the evidence, good, bad, and otherwise, to really understand best how to cope with a situation. For example, if we know that driving on a highway has risk associated with it, okay, we know that, we know that. However, most of us will assume driving on a highway as a necessary part of everyday life. And we are willing to take this risk. And we are willing to take this risk because if we didn't, our lives would be severely limited. And a positive aspect of driving on the highway is that it helps us to achieve our goals, to get to where we need to go. A negative one is that under some circumstances, driving can be dangerous. So when we examine the evidence, really dig in, we'll find that it's true that there are two sides to every coin. Well, then what? Right? When we think about things in this way, when we modify our thoughts, we can actually change our brains. Practicing different types of thought patterns over and over actually rewires our brain so that new, more realistic thought patterns, more helpful thought patterns can become more natural. This does not mean, that we, excuse me, our brains are permanently changed by thinking something new just once. It takes consistent practice, focus, intention, and motivation to keep the brain functioning well, just like it takes consistent exercise to keep our bodies healthy. And cognitive skills can really help us keep our brains healthy if we are willing to stay practiced at it. So that's an important piece to notice. So, excuse me, I have a little one at home today who was wanting to participate, and I'm going to ask her to just step into the other room, sweetie. Thank you.
Mom, can I help you say some more?
So thinking about this, we need to think about the how does this work? How does this work? So when we look back at the anxiety fuel section of the program, when we were going through the last 3 sessions, we discussed the snowball effect. We discussed the snowball effect that is effectively created when our negative thoughts, avoidant or protective behaviors, and our uncomfortable anxiety symptoms get mixed in together. Thoughts serve to make our anxiety worse and can even cause more problems for us, especially if they convince us to try to avoid what makes us anxious. Let's take our example of Bill. If we remember Bill, our friend from the exposure and desensitization session last week, he had a fear of public speaking, if you recall. So let's assume, you know, that we're back with Bill and he's had all of those negative thoughts about speaking in public. And they all come up when he starts to work on his speech. He starts to feel that fear, that apprehension, the fear of judgment, and so on. These thoughts cause him to want to avoid anything connected with the speech. He may procrastinate, he may not prepare for the speech adequately, or he may try to get out of the speech completely. So I'm going to challenge you to listen to some of these statements around speaking in public or any actual anxiety-inducing situation and see if they sound familiar. What if someone notices that I'm nervous? People might laugh at me. I might have to drop out of school. I'm absolutely going to screw this up. I'm going to fail at this. I'm not a good public speaker. Familiar? You know, most of us can relate to this dilemma. Most of us can understand. And that when Bill, our friend who's afraid of public speaking, has these thoughts, they increase his anxiety and they make him want to avoid the speech even more. And when we look at our own thoughts realistically, we basically throw water on that anxiety fire. So it's important that we really dig into this stuff. Responding to and modifying our negative thoughts so that they become more realistic is that way to avoiding things that are important to us. For example, if Bill avoids his class where he has to speak, we talked about that could impact his grade. It could impact his program. It could ultimately impact his career. And these are important things to dig into and recognize. Whoops, somehow I went backwards. Thinking about these things is important. And it is different than ruminating. And we've talked about the chewing on. This is a different kind of thinking. So when should we use this? Okay, we're going to use cognitive therapy skills when we can identify negative thoughts that make us feel worse in certain situations. We're going to use them when our anxiety is triggered by worries about the future and or negative thoughts about ourselves. It's really important to note, as we discussed in last week's session, the importance of unifying both our cognitive and our behavioral forces. So working with thoughts is just one part of our defense system, right? Our defense against anxiety. Simply learning to think differently can be quite helpful. However, we really can't underestimate the importance of behavior in maintaining our anxiety. So we do need to look at both of them as a partnership. For example, if Bill continues to avoid speaking in public, the anxiety is very likely to be there when he goes to do the speech, regardless of how he's thinking, right? Because he's been avoiding it. However, unifying our forces means that he's learning to use the cognitive skills while practicing confronting his fears with action, right? That exposure desensitization piece. And effective anxiety management really means using a lot of different forces, i.e. CBT skills, to battle anxiety. I really do want to note though, and we did talk a little bit about OCD in a couple of other sessions, if you have a diagnosis of OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, some types of cognitive skills may not be helpful. And OCD is typically best treated with exposure and response prevention, which is a very specific style of exposure treatment. So if you have OCD, it's best for you to work with a therapist or a group practice that has very specific training and practices in exposure response prevention, ERP. That being said, because there's always a that being said, it can be helpful or useful to practice the skills that we've talked about to learn to handle daily stressors, daily worries that may exist separate and apart from the OCD behaviors, right? So I just always want to throw in a little bit around that. So what are the take homes here? Well, cognitive skills are just one set of skills that we use in cognitive behavioral therapy. The goal is to examine the evidence, to uncover facts, both positive and negative, about any given situation. And by understanding the situation better, we learn to think more realistically about the likelihood of bad things happening. And we also work to find ways to cope in case these things do happen. But let's talk about automatic negative thoughts, negative automatic thoughts. We all have them. Every one of us has them, right? Sometimes they pop into our heads uninvited. Sometimes they stick in our heads for hours. We call those sticky thoughts, right? And those negative automatic thoughts are those thoughts that come to us automatically, hence the term, when we are feeling anxious, depressed, angry, frustrated. They can come at any time that we have a negative emotion. And there are different types of negative automatic thoughts. Worry is related to fear that something bad might happen in the future. And most troubles with anxiety really have some sort of worry attached to them. For example, if we think about, I might lose my job in my home, that's a worry thought. Another type of negative automatic thought is a negative statement about ourselves, other people, or the world at large. I'm an idiot. or that's not a worry statement so much as a declarative statement. And it makes us feel bad, right? And often people with depression have the kinds of thoughts. I wouldn't be able to tolerate it. I'm just going to snap, and so on and so forth. When we think about our anxiety in this context, we can feel far less isolated because we recognize that a lot of people are experiencing the same thing. Now, you may remember at our session, we were talking about anxiety 101. We talked about the fight or flight response and how that it automatically causes negative thoughts. So, and then we looked at it kind of in the context of chicken and egg, which comes first, the anxiety or the negative automatic thought, the negative automatic thought or the anxiety. One of the things that we can ask ourselves is, why do I have these negative thoughts when I'm anxious? When I'm feeling relaxed, I don't have these. And as we discussed earlier, there are good reasons that we experience negative thoughts when we're anxious. When we feel anxious, when we experience anxiety, our brain wants us to think about all of the potentially dangerous things in our environment, right? This is how we're hardwired. This is to keep us safe, right? This is our danger radar, to be sensitive to if there's an actual danger out there. Now imagine what would happen if we didn't have negative thoughts when we're in danger. We probably wouldn't be able to protect ourselves. We probably wouldn't even try to protect ourselves. And if we really are in danger, it is helpful to have some negative thoughts because we're more likely to try to stay safe if we think something is dangerous. The trouble happens sometimes we know that things are not dangerous, yet we have the thoughts anyway. And so that's why we use those cognitive skills to help our brains really get on board with what we know. That right now, in this moment, we are safe. But anxiety can make that situation seem so much more dangerous. And frustratingly, a dangerous situation can trigger anxiety. So the same holds true with our thoughts. Negative automatic thoughts can cause anxiety, while when we feel anxious, we're more likely to have negative thoughts. So it is that chicken and egg piece. So what are the types of negative automatic thoughts that we might have? Well, anxiety causes most people to assume the worst. That's the manifestation of anxiety, is assuming the worst. But there are many different kinds of anxiety-producing thoughts, and it's really helpful to know some of the common kinds so that you can recognize them. So for example, overestimating the likelihood of negative events happening. This is one of the common tendencies that we have, in that we tend to predict that dangerous things will happen in the future. And we often imagine that something may happen even when logically, right? When here we know that it's not likely to happen. So in the case of Bill, the guy with this public speaking, he may predict everybody's going to think I'm stupid if I make a mistake during my presentation. That would be an example of overestimating the likelihood of negative events happening. Okay, so that's a really fancy word to say we predict that something is going to be horrible or that awful things are going to happen if something bad happens. So in that case, we predict that we would not be able to cope. We would not have this capacity to cope, and consequently, we try to find any possible way to prevent the bad thing happening to avoid catastrophe. Now, the third one is our belief that anxiety itself is dangerous. And we talked about this in the first session. We really do often have thoughts that anxiety itself is scary, is dangerous. And we may predict that we might go crazy or lose control and not be able to function. We may believe that we're going to have a heart attack, pass out, suffocate when anxiety symptoms get really extreme. That's the belief that anxiety is dangerous. So these are some common negative thoughts. The belief that we can't tolerate discomfort, that we can't tolerate pain, negative events. When we question our ability to cope with future events because of this anxiety, this is really challenging for us, right? We start to tell ourselves, well, you know, if I can't tolerate this, what will happen if something really, really bad happens? Or, you know, I can't take this. I can't handle it. This is too much. And then we have those positive beliefs about worry. And you're like, what? What do you mean positive beliefs about worry? Well, positive beliefs about worry are that it's somehow protective. That if I don't worry about this, something may actually happen. And sometimes anxiety prompts us to get something done that we might otherwise avoid. And maybe we begin to rely on it for motivation, even if it's actually uncomfortable at the time. And finally, we have those negative thoughts about ourselves, about others, and about the world. So this is when we make negative assumptions or blanket statements, such as, you know what, I'm such a loser, or, you know what, nobody's ever going to like me. The world is a dangerous place. These kinds of just overarching statements can really make us feel much more anxious and actually lead to depressive symptoms as well. I'm hearing some notes about the audio. I'm just going to check my connection, so just give me a second, because somebody said the audio is cutting out. Connection. So hopefully. So we all ultimately have some patterns of negative thinking, and it depends on our experience, but sometimes these patterns can get out of control. When our negative thinking, our negative automatic thoughts, those patterns become very severe, when they become severe to the point that they're interfering with the enjoyment and quality of their life, then we may be looking at an anxiety disorder, which we talked about in the very first session. And every anxiety disorder has some characteristic negative automatic thoughts associated with them. So here on the screen, you'll see there are some examples of the negative automatic thoughts related to each disorder. So for example, if we look at panic disorder with agoraphobia, you might have the thought, I'm going to have another panic attack. This time I might have a heart attack. With social anxiety disorder, you might say something like, people don't like me, or people may notice my anxiety and think I'm weak, and so on, right down through post-traumatic stress. So you can see that each disorder has a specific kind of thought associated with it. So when you go to a practitioner and look for a diagnosis, they may be asking you questions that say, have you ever thought something like this? And this is helpful in diagnosing the type of anxiety disorder with which you are dealing. But what do we do, right? So the first step that we really need to do to begin restructuring or responding to our negative thoughts is to identify the thoughts that are giving us trouble, right? We need to identify them. So it's as if we're putting a magnifying glass to our minds to think about, to learn more about how we think. So we're really getting in there. And I want you to think now about, I'm going to sneeze. I love allergy season. Excuse me. I really want you to be very specific in thinking about your own negative thoughts. I want you to kind of look inward, and if you've got your notepad, this is a great place to kind of jot down some thoughts. Think about the kinds of thoughts you have. So you want to think about the kinds of negative thoughts that you experience, the kinds of thoughts that pop into your head. Can you have more than one? Yes, Lisa, you can. You can have concurrent for sure. So let's look at how to identify those thoughts. How do we do that? So during your day, jot down the various thoughts that come up. So, you know, we've talked about postponement, we've talked about, you know, kind of doing a worry journal and so on. So in the course of your daily life, write down the thoughts that pop up when you're feeling anxious. Sit quietly, try to imagine going into an anxiety-producing situation, and then think about what thoughts come up. So remember last week during exposure, we were coming up with like, what are your anxiety triggers and so on. Then spend some time and recall an event from the past that was anxiety-producing. And as you think about it, what thoughts were going through your mind at that time? And then here's a hard one. Role play an anxiety-inducing event with a friend, a family member, your therapist, and so on. And then jot down any thoughts that come up during this exercise. It's really important to remember that when you're identifying your thoughts, you want to phrase the thoughts in the form of a statement and avoid what ifs. Okay, so for example, if the thought is, what if I lose my job? I want you to rephrase it as, I will lose my job. Okay, so this is the thought. The thought is, I will lose my job. And be really specific about the fear. So it's better to break up more general thoughts into tinier, more manageable pieces. If the thought that pops in is, I feel like something bad is going to happen, then make a list of the specific things that you think might happen, that you're worried may happen, and write down the first automatic negative thoughts that come to your head. And you're going to use something called the thought cascade approach, which I'm going to share with you in a moment, to learn about what is most scary to you. And as you're going through this process, I really want you to notice the thoughts that seem to come up often or are more impairing or detrimental than others. And you may want to begin with these when you start working on your thoughts, the ones that are causing you the most challenge, the most difficulty. So let's have a look at what we call the thought cascade. So this is basically like one thought or one thing leads to another. So when we're feeling anxious, it's common to have a thought that leads to a more disturbing thought, which leads to an even more disturbing thought, which leads to an even more disturbing thought, and so on and so on. So you might start with, I'm going to lose my job. Then it goes to, I won't be able to pay my bills. I will lose my house and end up homeless. I will die homeless and penniless. And it goes on, right? And believe it or not, this domino effect of negative automatic thoughts is pretty common. And we can really, if we dig into this, we can use this technique to uncover some of our most troublesome worries. So when we're feeling anxious, it really is important to use this as a tool. So once you find some worry, some troublesome thought that is particularly difficult or particularly relevant for you in the moment, you can begin to work on it. So here on the next slide, I believe, here we go. I want you to start to work on the thought cascade. And this is something you could take a screenshot if you want, or you can take a photograph or jot it down. This is really a great technique to uncover those worries. So write down a thought in the form of a statement. Job. Then ask yourself, you can do 2 columns, ask yourself, what would be so bad if that happened? Oh, okay. Then what would be so bad about that? So in other words, what other bad things might happen if that first thing happens, right? So we're cascading it. And I want you to really dig into this. So maybe it's, I don't know, I might have, I will be in a car crash, right? So you're going to start to break down those things and go through the process to identify what the fear actually is and be really specific. This is a great way to kind of dig into what you're experiencing and how you're building on your negative automatic thoughts to create more and more and more negativity and anxiety. So what are the take-homes around this? Well, the first step of cognitive restructuring is to really identify those negative automatic thoughts and record them in a form of a statement. Not what if this happens, state it, this is happening or this will happen. And there are lots of different techniques that can be used to do this. Write down the thoughts in the course of your daily life. So take it, jot in your journal or notebook. Visualize those anxiety-provoking situations. Use the thought cascade method. These are all ways that we can start to build into our cognitive restructuring. One of the ways that we can do this is the daily thought record. I talk a lot about journaling, and as I've mentioned before, it's not like, Dear Diary. It's really more an opportunity to log your experiences. So one of the things that we're going to do, and I mentioned this already, is really, this is the steps, okay? These are the steps. Try to really have an opportunity to sit by yourself, to sit quietly. Imagine the going into that anxiety-producing situation. Maybe it's going to talk to your boss about your performance review. Maybe it's asking someone for a date, whatever it is. Then what types of thoughts come up? And as you're going through this process, recall the event from the past. Role play. Write down the thoughts that pop up during this exercise. Okay, so I really want you to consider this in a very methodical and intentional kind of way. while we're talking about cognitive restructuring, it's really important to think about cognitive distortion as well. So let's think about, have you ever been to, what's it called? Like billiard shows or the fair, the carnival, and you've seen those fun house mirrors. So we know how we really look, right? We have an idea of what we really look like from photographs, from our mirrors at home. But when we look at one of those fun house mirrors, the image is very different than what is real. And when we're anxious, the facts of a situation can become quite distorted as well. So those cognitive distortions are really patterns of thinking that are heavily influenced by our emotions. So if we start to look at a list of cognitive distortions, these distortions really tend to follow a certain pattern, and many of those tend to overlap with others. So let's look at some kind of specific facts about cognitive distortions. They're often black and white or all or nothing. They're very specific that way.
It's not cool.
Oh, shh, mommy's working. Cognitive distortions tend to emphasize negatives at the expense of the positives. And as we talked about earlier, we are definitely programmed, we are conditioned to think negatives first, because when we feel anxious, our bodies are really kicking in to try to protect us. Our cognitive distortions tend to be general instead of specific. And as we talked about last week, we can use very specific strategies to get there. So let's think about last week for a moment. We talked about Jessica, our friend who had witnessed a news broadcast around winter snowstorms when she was a child. And she became very, very afraid that she might be in danger if she were caught in one. So if you recall that, we talked about that last week. And some of her negative automatic thoughts had been, all winter weather is dangerous, or I'm going to get in an accident if I drive when it's snowing. So those were some of the thoughts that she had. And while it's true that occasionally winter storms can be dangerous, there are qualities of these thoughts that simply aren't true. So we call these distorted. We call these distorted because of the extreme nature of the thoughts. All storms are not dangerous, and most winter weather does not, in fact, harm people. But this is what the cognitive distortion does. It creates this idea, this belief that it is that severe, it is that bad, and it creates this all or nothing, black or white thinking. So what do we do, though, when our negative automatic thoughts do not seem to be distorted? Sometimes anxiety-producing thoughts are not completely distorted. In fact, there is some truth to almost all of our thoughts, right? There's usually some grain of truth, some grain of fact. The worry, I'm going to lose my job, may have some truth. It is, ultimately possible that one could lose your job, right? It's a possibility. And if you have determined that it's in fact likely that you will lose your job, we would say that this thought is not in fact distorted. At this point, we would really want to use the thought cascade approach to get to some related thoughts, such as, if I lose my job, I'm going to end up homeless and destitute. So we would want to look at any possible distortions in that thought, and so on and so on and so on. And we'll discuss, excuse me, as we will discuss a little bit more later, our main goal here is to learn how likely it is that something bad will happen, while also learning how to cope when bad things do happen to us. So therefore, whether a thought is distorted or not, we still have a lot of work to do. So for the purpose of today's session, I want you to think about possible distortion for each thought that you might have, even if you're convinced that the thought is not distorted. But why is it so important? Right? There's always that why. Why is it so important to understand cognitive distortion? When we understand our cognitive distortion, then we've conquered an important part of understanding our thoughts and preparing to work on them. And by understanding those common faulty patterns of thinking, it is much easier for us to notice our own patterns during the course of our daily lives, right? Because now we have an awareness And we can notice it, we see it, it pops up and we're like, oh, hey, I know what that thing is. And the more we notice these patterns, the more likely we are to be able to modify these thoughts and start feeling better. And that is the goal, right? The goal is to feel better about our anxiety, to feel better about where we are. In order to notice them, we need to actually know what they are, though. We need to know what we're looking for. So some examples of cognitive distortions might be black and white thinking, okay? Catastrophizing, jumping to conclusions, ignoring the positive, proclaiming my fault, right? Shoulds, magnifying, minimizing, creating labels, engaging in perfectionism, reasoning from our emotions. These are all things that are examples of cognitive distortions. And if you look at a series that I did for CMHA a few weeks ago, we really dug into what each of those is on a Friday afternoon session that we did a few weeks ago, all about the anxiety toolbox. So if you want to know more about these kinds of cognitive distortions, be sure to check that out, or you can private message me and we can talk more about those. But because we're being mindful of time, we're going to fly right by them just so you know what some of these are. So when we think about our anxiety, we have to recognize that it's possible that our thoughts are distorted in some way. We recognize that our cognitive distortions are thoughts that are heavily influenced by emotion, that they may not be consistent with the facts of a situation, and that an important part of cognitive therapy skills is identifying ways that thoughts are distorted and noticing patterns in our thinking. And as we become more and more aware of these patterns, we are better able to modify our anxiety-producing thoughts. So how do we really get into restructuring those thoughts? How do we get into those? So imagine you are a scientist studying the causes of pollution in a river. Okay, so you're an environmental scientist, you're digging into the causes of pollution. How would you approach this? What types of questions would you ask to uncover the truth? Now, you might look at local industry, you might look at plant populations, maybe invasive species. All of those would be potential causes. And you might look closely at samples of the water to determine the types of pollutants that are in the water. You would want to get as much information as possible, right? You'd be getting in as much information as possible to make sure that you were right about what you found, because we don't want to be wrong. And as we're exploring things kind of in that scientist mind, in that curiosity mind, we recognize that scientists know that there are many possible explanations for an event or phenomenon, and they spend countless hours trying to prove or disprove their hypotheses about what is happening and why it happens. And to do this, they sent up endless experiments, right? Ultimately, the goal is to find the best possible explanation for something. You might ask questions like, well, what are all the possible explanations for this? Are there any other possibilities? So now, taking this from our polluted river to our minds, imagine you're walking down the street and you see someone that you know fairly well. Okay, so John, you know John, and you see him and you look at him to say hello. And he looks away and says nothing in return. What type of interpretations might you have about this event? So you might think, you know what? I didn't know that John didn't like me. If he did, he would have too. Or John must be mad at me. Or what did I do to John? When we're living in that anxious brain, these are the kinds of thoughts we have. But what if we replace these knee-jerk responses, reactions, with a more scientific approach? So we could look further. We could look for other explanations, just like our scientists would. So we might look for other explanations as to why this person did not say hello. Jot them down. What are they? Maybe the sun was in his eyes. Maybe he was on a Bluetooth call. Maybe he was deep in thought. Maybe he didn't recognize us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're doing right there is an example, a very simple example of examining the evidence. And this is the most important element of cognitive restructuring. Okay, restructuring a thought means gathering evidence to see a situation more completely, more realistically, which can help us feel better. Okay, and that's a very simplistic explanation, but I hope you get the point. So our goal in cognitive restructuring is not to prove that the event will not happen. That's not the goal at all. Instead, we're trying to make a realistic assessment of how likely something is. So when working with our anxiety-related negative automatic thoughts, we want to look at different lines of evidence for each problem to get closer to the truth. So let's have a look at what we would ask. So the first question we're going to ask is, how likely is it that this event is going to happen? So research will tell us that when people are anxious, they typically overestimate the likelihood that something bad is going to happen. For example, we worry about the possibility of losing our job in the economy, where it is right now, without knowing the details of the economy and how it specifically impacts our company. Okay? We may predict that the flight we're on is going to crash into the ocean without knowing the details of aerodynamics of flight. So to get more detail about the likelihood of something bad happening, we ask questions like, what percentage likelihood is it that this event will happen? Am I 100% sure? Am I 50% sure? What evidence do I have that this is likely to happen in the future? Is there evidence that it's not likely? How many times have I predicted that this would happen? How many times has it actually happened? And the goal, as I said, is not to prove that the event will not happen. It's to make that realistic assessment that it might happen. How realistic is it likely to happen? And then we might go down the line of reasoning of, if it did happen, how bad would it be? Would I be able to cope? What would I do if this did happen? We also know that when we're anxious, we tend to catastrophize. We tend to worst case scenario things. We blow things out of proportion when we feel anxious. So we often predict that we would not be able to handle a negative event if it occurred. We also don't think much about what we would do if a bad event happened, right? We don't think about future action. So for example, most people, if faced with the challenge of losing their job, would eventually get back out and start looking for another. But often in the throes of anxiety, we don't think this far ahead. We stop after that initial thought about how bad it would be, and we focus on preventing that thing from happening. We don't think about problem solving. So to look at this question, we might ask ourselves, okay, how bad would it really be if it happened? What would I do? What would I do if this thing happened? How would I cope? Would I be able to move on? How would I move on? If it did happen, what would be the worst possible consequence? And by looking at this basic question in a much more detailed way, we may actually discover that we could cope if an unfortunate event actually did happen. We may build a sense of resiliency and strength. But are you a gambler? Are you a gambler? We predict ourselves anxious so often. So I don't know if you've ever made a bet with someone. Like as a kid, we always made bets. I bet you can't climb that tree. I bet you can't run faster than I can. Think of the last time you made a bet with someone. How much did you bet? Money? Doing the dishes? Walking the dog? How confident did you have to feel in order to make that bet? 100% confident? 50% sure? You may know, and I've got a picture of horses here, because people often bet on horse races and look at the odds, right? They look at the odds that a certain horse has to win before placing their bet. People want to know how likely it is that they will win or lose before making their decision. We don't often use the same situation or the same system to gauge the chances of a negative event happening in our lives. And it's really curious, right? Because we know that when people are anxious, they overestimate that the bad thing will happen. We know this. So that would be like betting all of our money, every last on the underdog horse because we felt lucky that day. It might win, but the odds are against it. And this style of negative thought features prediction, right? And if you remember when we talked about cognitive distortion, this is also called fortune telling. So when it comes to anxiety, we may find it's better to get all of the information before betting that something bad will happen. And we go into looking at different lines of questioning to get to the key question again. So how likely is it that this negative event will happen? Again, we're not looking at any evidence at this point. We're looking at any evidence at this point, not just evidence that disputes our fear. So what percentage likelihood is it that's going to happen? Is there any evidence that it's not likely? What evidence do I have that it's likely to happen in the future? How much money would I bet that this is going to happen? How many times have I predicted this would happen in the past? And when I did predict that this would happen in the past, how often did it actually happen? So we're really digging in. We're really getting focused at determining the likelihood. So take a moment, take out a pen and paper, jot down. I want you to think about a fear that you have about the future, a worry thought. And using the techniques that we've already talked about here this morning, I want you to identify a particular thought that you have that is challenging or difficult. So have your thought. So focus on a predictive thought like I will lose my job, or she will reject me. Write it down. And remember to phrase it in the form of a statement, not what will happen if or what if, but this is going to happen. And then start jotting down those answers to those same questions. What percentage likelihood is it that this will happen? 100%, 50%, 20%? How sure are you? What evidence do I have that this is likely to happen? Is there any evidence that it's not likely? You hear I'm repeating the questions that I just said. How much money would I bet that this would happen? How many times have I predicted this would happen? How many times has it actually happened? And when you've finished answering those questions, you should have a very good idea of the likelihood that this event will happen in your life. And sometimes we may realize that this event is really not likely. And we will determine that it's just not worth the effort to try to protect ourselves or fix the problem. And then we can remind ourselves of this evidence when we have that thought again. Of course, sometimes bad things really do happen, right? It's just life. Sometimes bad things happen. If it really is likely that something bad could happen, if something bad did happen, how bad would it be? Remember that the purpose of what we just talked about is to make a realistic assessment of how likely something is. That's a really key element of examining the evidence to support our anxious thoughts. So imagine someone called you on the phone or texted you and said, come home quickly, something horrible has happened. What type of thing goes through your head? What kinds of do you think would have happened? So let's list a few possibilities. If I got that call, I'd think a fire, or someone is ill, injured, or dead. I would just think of, catastrophic, horrible, life-changing events if someone said that. Now, think about some of the thoughts and worries that you have identified for yourself. How do they compare with these kind of life-changing, horrible events? We know that when we feel anxious, we tend to catastrophize. We blow out of proportion. So because of this, that big part of the cognitive restructuring is the question, how bad would this be? How bad would it be if this event did actually happen? So we can use a catastrophe, right? It's like a thermometer, but like for catastrophes. So you may have had the thought, I know it's not likely that it will happen, but if it did, it would be terrible. So it can be helpful to look at your potentially difficult event or potentially difficult situation to really determine how bad it would actually be and how you would cope if it did happen. So let's use this catastrophe to rate different types of challenging events to measure how catastrophic those events would be if they happened to you. So you see on the screen, I've got 6, and then so we've got argument with a friend or a loved one, death of a loved one, got injured in a car accident, loss of job, heard someone say something mean about you, home got flooded, and then I'm going to encourage you to choose 2 of your own that would be bad events for you, catastrophic events, and then rate them. 0, no trouble coping at all. 3, a few bad days, but recover quickly. 5, take substantial time to, it would happen. 7 to 8, you'd be impaired for a while. 10, fall apart, go crazy, never recover. Okay, those. Think about where they would fit on that continuum. One goal of this exercise is to notice the difference between the different types of negative events. We can learn that not all bad events have the same degree of severity, regardless of how they play out in our minds. So what if horrible things really happened or could happen to me? What then? They do. Sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes horrible things happen, and it's likely that we will experience anxiety around these events. In fact, we should all expect that we will be confronted with very difficult circumstances at some point in our lives. We are human. This is the reality of life. There's no way to prevent bad things from happening forever. But when horrible things happen, we need to find ways to grieve our losses and learn to cope so that we can move on with our lives. So an important part of cognitive restructuring and cognitive behavioral therapy is learning to cope better when bad things do happen. Excuse me, it is really dry. Another common tendency that we have when we're anxious is to underestimate our ability to cope, right? We just think, I'm not gonna be able to handle it. And we may think that we're not gonna be able to handle the emotions associated with that challenging event. So I want you to think back to a difficult event that you've had in the past. So, what's a past event that was hard for you? How did you handle it? What did you do to cope? How long did it take you to get over it? So I'd just like you to just take a moment, think about a couple of things, jot them down, and then ask yourself, were you able to cope? Were you able to move on from these past events, or are you still mired in the consequences? And if you were able to cope, this might give you some solid evidence that you're much better at coping than you think you are. And if you feel that you were not able to cope, a part of the work you could do with your therapist, with a counselor, would be to work on coping skills, resiliency skills to better handle future negative events. And a big part of cognitive behavioral therapy is coping skills. So past tough event, what you did to cope, how long did it take to overcome and move on? So based on what we've already thought about today, the kind of topics of negative thoughts that you've had, oh, Colette, I'm so very sorry. I'm very sorry. That must have been very, very, very difficult. Thank you for sharing that. That's very vulnerable. And I appreciate you being so honest. Thank you, Colette. If we now reflect on the things that we've thought about, I want you to now do an exercise about gathering evidence, okay? So we're trying to look at our situations realistically. So we are going to have both positive and negative evidence about the situation. So think of a prediction that you've had, some sort of prediction about the future that leads you to feel anxious. So write it down and then answer the questions. If this happened, would it be horrible? What are the likely consequences that this would happen? Or certain likely consequences of this happening, pardon me. If it did happen, would I be able to cope? If it happened, what would I do? Would I always be affected by this, or would I eventually get over it, eventually get through it? Right? So we need to really think about things in those contexts. So if this happened, would it be horrible? What are the likely consequences of this happening? If it happened, would I be able to cope? If it did happen, what would I do? And would I always be affected by this, or would I eventually get over it? Somebody last week asked to have puppies all the time. There's another puppy. Excuse me. We know that people who write things down as part of their cognitive behavioral therapy practice do better than those who try to keep it all in their heads. Okay, it does involve more work, and it can feel an awful lot like going back to school, but I really hope you will give it a try. And just like any other skill, keep at it until it becomes more natural. So we've examined the two main questions that we ask when we're trying to learn more about an anxiety-provoking situation. But once we know which questions, we need to start to record our evidence to build a strong, realistic argument. So when we're beginning to use cognitive restructuring, it's really helpful to write down our thoughts, our distortions, and the evidence until we get the hang of it. So in this example, you'll notice that we use the skill of identifying the thought. Oh, I cut off my image. Shoot, sugar. Okay. So we've got the thought, the negative thought, the possible distortion, and then a rational response. So in this case, we're really looking at gathering the evidence, positive or negative, to help remind us of the truth of a situation where we're feeling anxious. And I've often will say, etc., after each rational response to help remember that there's more and more and more information, okay? So I may have as many as 7 to 10 different facts listed for every negative thought that I have. So, and we're going to use multiple lines of evidence to do this. So this really does help us illuminate each individual aspect of a situation. For example, one common line of evidence is our own personal experience examined in detail, or it might be a family member's experience, right? So going back to John on the street, he must hate me because he didn't say hello. Well, maybe it was possible he was thinking of other things. He hasn't been focused. He was looking the other way. He looked down at the ground, or he looked at me, but he was doing that stare, you know, that one where you're like, you look right through someone, and so on and so on. So it's really important that we dig in very consciously and very deliberately to examine our thoughts. And jotting it down is much more effective than just doing it here. Whoops, I don't know where I just went there. Franklin Roosevelt, former president of the United States during the Depression. This quote is often used out of context. There's more to it, but we frequently say the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In one of the most difficult economic periods in US history, he said this. And sometimes the truth is our reaction to negative events is fearful, which ends up causing more problems. So if the stock market were to crash as it did in 1929, as it did back in 2008, then people would become more and more afraid, pull their money out of stocks, pull their money out of banks, causing more and more trouble for the economy. So our own reactions are very similar. Our fearful reactions to our body's fight, flight, or freeze response and its attempt to keep us safe can actually make our anxiety worse. In this case, the fear of fear is actually the fear of anxiety. And this means that we are afraid of having anxiety symptoms. We believe that the anxiety symptoms are going to be intolerable or that they're going to last forever. We worry that others are going to notice our symptoms. We try to get rid of them, push them away, distract our anxiety. And we've talked about how anxiety can be triggered by something in the world or in our minds. And once the anxiety related to a trigger becomes severe, we begin to fear the anxiety symptoms themselves. We avoid anything that makes us feel anxious. We try to protect ourselves, safety behaviors, from anything, from the anxiety. We also tend to have negative thoughts about the anxiety itself. And so this is when we talked about anxiety fuel a couple sessions ago, and we learned that our thoughts can actually make our anxiety worse. And these thoughts often sound like things like, well, if this happens, I will have anxiety. I won't be able to tolerate the anxiety. My anxiety will never end. if I have a panic attack, I could have a heart attack, I could faint, I could suffocate, I could go crazy, I could die, right? And as we discussed before, these thoughts create that massive snowball effect. Anxiety, thought, acting on each other. So our brain really does begin to believe that we're in danger. So in CBT, we really step in, we restructure these thoughts so they can't continue to make our anxiety worse. All right, still with me? Okay, so anxiety, of course, is uncomfortable. Nobody's going to deny that, and we don't want to pretend that it isn't uncomfortable, but you don't have to experience the intensity of the discomfort. Sometimes negative thoughts about the anxiety can make it worse, and so let's look at some of those common thoughts that fuel that fear. So if that happens, I will have anxiety. I won't be able to tolerate that. Okay, so the line of evidence, past experience, right? When I had anxiety before, it was really intolerable. Oh, but wait, how many days have I experienced anxiety in my life? Pick a number, right? Of those days, how many times did I think I can't tolerate it? Pick a number. Did I get through it? Oh, you did. Okay. How many times did you do? What's more important? How you respond to adversity. Was it actually intolerable, or was it really uncomfortable? And is there a difference? So that's kind of one line of evidence. Line of evidence number two, the future with or without your anxiety. You know, what would it be like to not have that anxiety? Is it worth it to work on minimizing it, using whatever methods necessary? And am I willing to do this for the future, even if it means feeling some discomfort now? Is it really best to be completely anxiety-free? Is this even realistic? These are all really important questions to ask. And then line of evidence number three is the likelihood of experiencing some pain in the future. Ask yourself, is it likely that I will experience some pain in the future? Probably, right? Is it possible to prevent pain completely? Probably not. Is it best to try to avoid all pain and discomfort, or to learn to cope with pain and discomfort? Okay, so these are the ways that we kind of break down that fear, break down and get into a better mindset, that cognitive restructuring. So then we might say something like, well, you know, that anxiety will never end. And we go through the same thing. Line of evidence number one, personal experience. I can think back to an event in which I felt anxious. How long did it last? Did the severity change? If and when it ended, how did I feel? Line of evidence number two, our body's programmed to turn off the fight or flight response after about 10 minutes. Remember we talked about that? Yeah, okay, well that's good to know. So wonder, how many of you have been told just count to 10? Just count to 10, right? When you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling nervous, when you're feeling apprehensive, just count to 10. Have you ever tried it? It can feel hard to believe that just giving yourself a count of 10 could actually be beneficial. After all, like when we're feeling anxious, it feels like it's never going to end, right? The truth is, our bodies are not programmed to allow anxiety to last forever. And as I said, once our anxiety is triggered, it's programmed to last for about 10 minutes. That's all. So why does it seem like it's going on and on and on? Well, if we go back to the anxiety fuel section that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the main reason that anxiety stays around is that the fight or flight response gets triggered and re-triggered and re-triggered. And those repetitive negative thoughts are one way the snowball effect happens. However, if we do not re-trigger the anxiety by thinking about it over and over again, or trying too hard to protect ourselves, the anxiety response is programmed to turn off. So the truth is, anxiety will not last forever if we give it a chance to shut down. This is why just counting to 10 can be helpful. So we can practice this particular technique of emotional regulation by reminding ourselves to ride it out. Ride the wave of anxiety without acting on it, without trying to fix it, or even giving it a chance to take hold, just allowing it a chance to come down on its own. Right? Count to 10. But as important as this is, It does not mean our only job is to learn to ride it out. Okay, because that's only one portion. Over the long run, we're going to work to reprogram our thoughts using those cognitive therapy skills so the anxiety gets triggered and re-triggered much less frequently, with much less intensity. But what about panic? Sometimes our fear of fear can reach absolute panic proportions. Our heart races, we get dizzy, we get lightheaded, there's pressure in our head, our chest, the feeling of choking, racing thoughts, a sense of dread, a sense of doom. And because these symptoms are so intense, it's understandable that we might, there are four catastrophic predictions that we make when we're feeling panic. I'll have a heart attack, I will suffocate, I will faint, I will go crazy. So let's look at them, each of them. So I will have a heart attack. So first line of evidence is our personal history. So we really need to look at that. It's easy to understand why it feels like we're having a heart attack during a panic attack. Your heart's beating faster and harder, it's strong, there's a tightness in the chest or a heaviness, feelings of dread and doom. Well, how many panic attacks have you had in the past? How many of these were accompanied by predictions that you would have a heart attack? How many heart attacks were connected with the panic attacks that you did have? Have I been a good predictor of heart attacks in the past? Have I gotten any medical tests to assess my current risk of a heart attack? What have my doctors told me? Given my history with panic attacks versus heart attack, is it more likely that this is a panic attack or heart trouble? Okay, these are some questions you want to ask yourself. Then, line of evidence number 2, good clinic history, research. Can I actually have a panic attack during a heart attack? We're going to talk about that in a moment. Line of evidence number 3, the difference between a panic attack and a heart attack. Are there any differences? Good question. Well, let's have a look. Is it a heart attack or is it a panic attack? This is a really common question, right? And I see clients in the office all the time, and they'll say, "Hey, I went to the emergency room this weekend. I thought I was having a heart attack." This is a thought that can land you in the emergency room, only to be told you're fine when the medical tests come back, and that can feel very invalidating, right? Many people predict that they're going to have a heart attack during a panic attack. That is very common, but there is no evidence that there is any connection between a panic attack and a heart attack. Senior clinicians in many medical clinics in, here in New Brunswick, around the country, nearly always report that they have never seen a heart attack caused by panic. This means that in thousands of patients with possibly millions of panic attacks, there are few to no reports of panic attacks leading to heart attack. So this actually means that your chance of having a heart attack during your next panic attack is very, very small. Now, would it be helpful to remind yourself of this? Now, I know it's scary because symptoms of a heart attack and a panic are very similar. So common symptoms, heart attack symptoms that is, uncomfortable pressure, fullness, squeezing or pain in the center of the chest, lasting more than a few minutes, mild to intense pain spreading to the shoulders, neck, or arms, may feel like pressure, tightness, burning, heavy weight, could be located in the chest, the upper abdomen, neck, jaw, inside the arms or shoulders, chest discomfort with lightheadedness, fainting, sweating, nausea, shortness of breath, all common, along with anxiety, nervousness, sweating, cold, clammy skin, increased or irregular heart rate, and a feeling of impending doom. Those are common symptoms of a heart attack. Does that sound familiar? Because many of these symptoms are exactly the same. But one thing that can separate a panic attack from a heart attack is that panic attacks tend to improve with movement and exercise, while heart attack symptoms will get worse under those conditions. Also, panic tends to reach its peak in that 10-minute mark and will predictably decline gradually over time, but a heart attack will not get better over time. So of course, it is very, very important to be aware of any potential physical problems, especially if there's any history of heart disease in your family. This is why it's so important to be very honest with your family doctor, with your primary care physician, with your nurse practitioner, etc. Because the symptoms are so similar that you need to really have a good family history about heart disease, age, knowledge of your own heart health. And so the best way to solve this particular dilemma, is it a heart attack or a panic attack, is to get treatment. Okay? Get treatment. So it's really important to notice that. And a panic attack will feel like a heart attack whether you're 7 or 77, right? The anxiety symptoms are similar. Age is not a factor in how these symptoms present, right? I see children in my office who express the same exact symptoms, right? So it's really important that you have those conversations so that you can be sure that what you're experiencing is not a cardiac event. I would never want to assume that it wasn't and have it be one. So having a good health history, good, honest communication with your primary care practitioner is so critical. Okay, symptom number 2 that we start to think about when it comes to panic, I'm gonna suffocate, right? Whew. Again, we look at personal history. How many panic attacks have I had in the past? How many of these were accompanied by these predictions that I would suffocate? Have I ever suffocated during a panic attack? Have I been a good predictor of suffocation in the past? Line of evidence number 2. Can't get enough air. Well, during a panic attack, the feeling of smothering and tightness in the chest often that you're not going to get enough oxygen and will suffocate. What we have discovered, however, is that when one is panicking, you're frequently getting too much oxygen by over-breathing, by breathing very quickly. And this over-oxygenation, hyperventilation, is what makes you feel dizzy and lightheaded. Suffocation occurs when your body does not get enough oxygen. So it is highly unlikely, not saying it's impossible, but it's highly unlikely that panic will lead to suffocation. Okay, so it's really important that we look at the likelihood when we're dealing with these predictive thoughts. Number 3, I'm gonna faint, right? That feeling of, oh my gosh, in panic, you're feeling so lightheaded. Okay, so again, personal history. How many times have I fainted in the past? Have I been evaluated to determine if I have a medical problem that could lead to fainting, right? So it's really important that we rule out biological, physiological, medical conditions. How many panic attacks have I had that were associated with a fainting spell in which I actually passed out and lost consciousness? Okay, so it's an important distinction. And if I did pass out, how bad would that be? Would I be able to cope? Would it be a catastrophe? So asking yourself these very specific questions. And then line of evidence number 2, compatibility between fainting and panic attacks. So the idea that we might faint during a panic attack is very common. Anxiety leads to dizziness, it leads to lightheadedness, it leads to tunnel vision, and other strange sensations that make us feel faint. But it is very, very rare for a person to pass out during a panic attack. And this is because during panic attacks and periods of high anxiety, we also have high blood pressure, elevated blood pressure. And very frequently when we pass out, it's due to a drop in our blood pressure. Now, there are people who have a type of anxiety called blood injury or illness phobia, in which passing out is common. And if you think you have this condition, or if you have passed out multiple times in the past, discuss this with your doctor, okay? Again, we want to be very, very cautious around this and look at multiple combined ways to deal with this. And if you don't have a predisposition to fainting, it's unlikely that you're going to pass out during a panic attack. It can be really important to remind yourself that it will feel like you're going to pass out, but it's most likely that you will simply continue to feel dizzy and lightheaded. And then number 4 around panic attacks is I might go crazy. Again, line of evidence, personal history. How many panic attacks have I had in the past? How many of these were accompanied by predictions that you would go crazy or lose it? Have you ever actually gone crazy or lost it during a panic attack? Have you been a good predictor of going crazy in the past? And then line of evidence number 2 is define going crazy and losing it. What does that actually mean? Are you worried about having, I'm going to put in air quotes, crazy thoughts or feelings? Are you worried about doing something irrational? Or is there something specific that you're worried that you might do? Hurt yourself or hurt someone else or make a scene? If so, what are the chances that you would actually do this thing? And then what can you do when you're feeling panicky to prevent any erratic or harmful behaviors? And then line of evidence number 3, what is your clinicians, your doctors, your nurse practitioners' experience with this? How many of their patients have lost it as a result of panic attacks? And then line of evidence number 4, the relationship between panic and psychosis or psychotic disorders. Ask yourself, could I lose it? Well, yeah. Often folks with extreme anxiety and panic worry that they will eventually lose it. They're eventually just going to lose touch with reality, that they'll do something extreme. Is it possible? Well, losing it is often equated with losing touch with reality. So based on current research, there is no evidence that anxiety and panic are directly causative of disorders that include psychosis. So that would be schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc. If you don't have a history of one of these illnesses, panic is not likely to lead you there. We can remind ourselves that this feels very uncomfortable, but I'm not going crazy. This is my body's attempt to protect me. And if you're worried about doing something harmful or you have a history of erratic behavior, talk to your therapist, okay? Talk to your doctor to find ways to keep yourself and others safe. And finally, panic thought number 5. This panic is going to hurt me in the long run. Piece of mint. The line of evidence number 1. What are the pros and cons of aggressive treatment versus avoiding panic? Right? What's going to happen if I continue to avoid the sensation of panic? Will it get better? If it doesn't get better by avoiding it, is it possible that continuing to take this approach is going to hurt me? Is it better to avoid in order to feel safe now, or to accept that I'm going to be uncomfortable now so I can feel better in the long run? So we're always weighing those back and forth, back and forth. It is true that chronic uncontrolled anxiety causes stress on our bodies. Absolutely true. And that makes us more susceptible to illness, more susceptible to chronic health conditions. But one way that we can view this dilemma is to assess how well our methods that we've used currently or in the past are actually treating the anxiety. How well are they working? And if they haven't worked, how likely is it that they will work in the future? If they're not working, we could be increasing the lifespan of our anxiety, which could cause even more stress in the long run. So addressing the anxiety through treatment, while it may cause some stress in the short term, may reduce our stress in the long term. And it's very common to find that short-term pain can offer us long-term gain. So take-homes around this, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A common type of fear that we may have is fear of the anxiety symptoms themselves. And while this type of anxiety is a defining feature of panic disorder, it is also common in other types of anxiety. Our thoughts about anxiety are often negative and make the problem worse. And in the short term, it can be helpful to learn to ride out episodes of anxiety so that we don't fuel the anxiety. Remembering that our bodies are conditioned to have episodes of anxiety for only 10 minutes unless we re-trigger them. Again, it's important to remember that restructuring our thoughts related to our fear of fear is just one part of our overall treatment. It may also be helpful to use these skills to address other types of thoughts, such as everyday worries, negative thoughts about social situations, and we may also need to use behavioral skills such as exposure or relaxation skills. And most people find that a combination of methods and skills works best in managing their anxiety over the long term. So let's look at some skills for daily worry and generalized anxiety. It's getting really warm down here. Holy moly, I need an air conditioner. So when we're worried, people want to reassure us. Don't worry, they say, calm down, just stop worrying. Of course, just not worrying is much easier said than done. Trying to control worrying can be challenging, can be frustrating. Generalized anxiety disorder is the technical term for the condition in which we just experience uncontrollable worry. One fearful thought is replaced by another, and after a while, it may seem that we worry about just about everything. Repetitive automatic negative thoughts, worry, are the hallmark characteristic of generalized anxiety disorder. The triggers of anxiety are the thoughts of themselves. And because thoughts are such a big part of GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, cognitive skills are a primary component of treatment for this problem. So there are two basic types of worries common in GAD. One type is worry about bad things happening to us or to people close to us. According to anxiety researchers, this type of worry is called type 1. Excuse me. Type 2 worry is worry about the worrying itself. So in type 1 worry, we're worried about ourselves or people close to us, and in type 2 worry, we're worried about the worry itself, the fear of fear, right? And in order to treat GAD effectively, it's best to treat both types of worries. So we're going to go through some examples. So type 1 worry, we worry about bad things happening to us or people we care about. I'm going to lose my job. My children might get sick or hurt. I'm not going to pass the test, et cetera, et cetera. Type 2 worry will be, I will never stop worrying. I can't tolerate this anxiety. I must find a way to stop worrying. If I keep worrying like this, I'm going to go and so on. So these are the two different kinds of worry thoughts that are the hallmarks of GAD. And if we remember, we looked at the snowball effect. We have this sensation that I have this worry, and then you have that related worry. Then we have those sensitizing behaviors, physical anxiety symptoms, worry about the worry, and it just is a cyclical snowball, and it just goes on and on and on and on, and it becomes quite exhausting. So let's look at an example. Let's take the example of I will lose my job. Okay, that's a common worry, especially in economic climate. I will lose my job. So there's very specific steps to how we process this in a healthy way. So first, we're going to identify the possible cognitive distortions present in that statement, I will lose my job. So step 1, identify them. For example, it might be jumping to conclusions or magnification, right? And we talked about those when we talked about distortions. Step 2, examine the evidence. Line of evidence number 1, what is the likelihood? Right now, are there reasons to believe that I would lose my job? What has happened to make me believe this? Have there been rumors? Have I heard anything about my job being in jeopardy? Have I gotten feedback about my performance that suggests it? Have there been performance evaluations that were negative? How likely is it that I will lose my job? Assign a percentage to that, so on and so on. So examining the evidence. Step 3, write down the evidence. Okay, write it down. Write it down, write it down. If it is likely that I will lose my job, how bad will it be? How bad will it be? If it happened, what would I do? Would I give up? Would I continue to look for jobs? Are there other possibilities? Is it likely that the people closest to me would be frustrated with me or disrespect me, or are they likely to be supportive? When other people lose their job, what do I think of them? Am I critical or am I supportive? Are there things I can do to improve, to reduce the risk of losing a job in the future? What have I done in the past when I was faced with adversity? Did I find ways to cope? How did things turn out? These are all things that we need to look at. When you've examined the evidence and written down the evidence, you can carry this with you. You can jot it down on a recipe card and pull it out when the thought occurs in your daily life. So if this is a thought that occurs regularly, have that with you so you can see it, or put it in your phone and remind yourself of the facts of the situation and then carry on. Then you can use the thought cascade approach, right? So remember we said, I will lose my job, then I will have no money, then I will lose my home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do this to uncover the other thoughts that you have around the situation, especially if you determine that it is likely that the thing will happen. Ask yourself, well, if I did, lose my job, what would be bad about that? What would be the consequence? And use these same techniques around any other evidence and thoughts that you have. Step 5, use some problem-solving techniques. Do you remember we talked about problem-solving techniques in the past? And then use acceptance skills. Use those acceptance skills to let go of the things, let go of the effort to fix the things that you cannot change. And if you look at the work of Marsha Linehan in dialectical behavior therapy, she talks a lot about radical acceptance, the notion that this is a thing, I cannot change it, I don't have to like it, it simply is. I'm just going to pause for a moment and look at the chat to see a question. We have to look to other experiences to learn lessons and to be ready. Yes, but not to the point of causing that hamster wheel of anxiety, right? We don't want to get into that place where we're looking at someone else's experience and assuming it will be the same as ours. Preparation is definitely one thing. Over preparation is anxiety. And it's really important that I don't have a link, Patrina. No, I don't, sorry, for the acceptance author. Her name is Marsha Linehan, or you can just look up the term, just Google the term radical acceptance, and that's a mindfulness practice. So radical acceptance. Okay, so I know that we're getting short on time. It's 12:30, and I did have a couple of other examples that I wanted to run through with you, but I think we're going to skip ahead in the interest of time. Yes, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. In the interest of time, I'd like to skip ahead a little to make sure that we're covering all the materials rather than going through multiple examples. And if we have time, we'll come back to some examples. So I just have to skip ahead a little bit here. Give me a moment. So if we want to just look at our take-home points from cognitive skills for daily worry and generalized anxiety disorder, we want to remember that GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, is really uncontrollable worry about multiple areas of your. There are 2 types of worry that are associated: worry about bad things happening to ourselves or people close to us, type 1 worry, and worry about the worry itself, type 2 worry, both of which contribute to the chronic anxiety symptoms. Worries, related worries, frustration, worry about the anxiety, attempts to fix, avoidance, physical anxiety symptoms all create that snowball effect that make the anxiety worse, both in the moment and in the long run. And since thoughts are the primary trigger of anxiety in GAD, cognitive therapy skills really are important as a treatment component. And so we're using those lines of evidence to gather facts about the situation to ensure that we're looking at the likelihood of bad things, that we understand the percentages, how we've survived in the past and how we've coped in the past, and how to find ways to cope with consequences in the future. Problem solving and acceptance skills are really important aspects of coping with GAD, and they're really useful in addressing negative automatic thoughts. These are all important pieces. So when we look at CBT skills for generalized anxiety, there are lots of factors. There are lots of elements that influence how anxious we are on a daily basis. And one element, one factor is our core belief, our ideas about the world around us. And these are what we might call, for those, who do schema therapy, these would be our core schemas. Thoughts such as, I must always give 110%. People that make less than a certain amount of money per year are failures. People who have a certain lifestyle are unacceptable. These are core schemas. These are things that are helpful to modify if we're experiencing GAD. And modification of core schemas are a part of CBT that might be helpful for you. So this would be something you'd really want to talk about with your therapist when you're digging in to your generalized anxiety. And there are lots of other factors other than the way we think that can contribute to generalized anxiety. Some might be the goals that we set and whether or not we're reaching them. How busy we are. You know, I've talked about how we live in a culture of busyness where we almost have a cult of busyness, where we want to magnify and amplify the perfection of busy. Setting reasonable, achievable goals, managing our time effectively, engaging in appropriate self-care and self-compassion are often addressed in CBT treatment. common thoughts that people have about their own anxiety can make it hard to move forward and address the anxiety problem assertively. So let's have a look at some of those common thoughts. Let's have a look at some of these things. So we have thoughts of anxiety being outside of our own control. We may have pessimistic predictions about our treatment. We may have unrealistic expectations about the speed of improvement. We may have deficiencies in our own knowledge. We may feel that with our worry or anxiety, our panic is harmful. We might faint. We may have what we call positive anxieties about our anxiety or worry. That means, like, if I worry about something, it's going to be helpful. So to go to your question, LGG7, that is anxiety helps me. If I don't worry about something, I'm not prepared. If I don't prepare, I'm not going to perform as well. I won't perform as well, I'll fail, and so on. So there's that predictive behavior, looking around the world as a positive belief around anxiety. When we think about things like deficiencies in our knowledge, we may think, well, I don't understand, I don't know, I don't even know why my anxiety happens. I can't understand how knowing this could be helpful for me. And we have those pessimistic predictions about our treatment. It's never going to go away. I haven't gotten better yet, so it's not going to happen. Perhaps, excuse me, unrealistic expectations about the speed of our improvement. Well, I want it to go away right now. I want a cure right now. I want this to happen immediately. I don't have time to spend on this. That's a pessimistic perspective. Believing that our anxiety is outside of our control. It just happens. I have no control over it. I'm completely frozen by my anxiety. I can't do anything about it. My anxiety is different than everybody else's. I can't control my anxiety. These are all things that these are common thoughts about anxiety and its treatment. And it's important that we recognize them. So cognitive therapy skills are only one set of skills used in CBT. They're based on the idea that our thoughts affect how we feel. We know that they're not just thinking positively, but rather thinking accurately. In fact, some situations really are bad, right? Our goal is to examine the evidence, practice reminding ourselves of this evidence when we're in a challenging situation in order to cope better with that situation. And cognitive skills are really best used in conjunction with other skills, such as behavioral skills like exposure. And if we can understand how dangerous a situation truly is, then we can make good decisions about whether or not it would improve our lives if we were to stop avoiding a situation or protecting ourselves. So let's talk about putting it all together. You've learned over the last 4 weeks about many of the skills that you might see if you're doing CBT with a therapist. So we're going to use an analogy of a tug of war to describe our battle with anxiety and stress over time. We want to look at treatment of anxiety in a realistic, effective way. We can talk about the balance between risk and the protection that underlies each decision that we make, and how these decisions can make us more or less vulnerable to anxiety. So let's have a look. Think about a tug of war. Think about the last time you actually had a tug of war. I don't know if any of you have done that. At a fair, at a beach, at a backyard picnic, your team has some influence on the outcome, right? But the other team may or may not make it really hard for you to achieve your aim. And managing anxiety over the long term can feel an awful lot like a tug of war. And despite our attempts at creating a happy, comfortable life, there's always the possibility that some external stressor, like an accident, a job loss, interpersonal conflict, could arise. And one important goal of CBT skills is to give us the confidence that we can cope with these unexpected stressors when they happen. So the opponent in a game of tug of war is really as integral to the game as stress is to our own lives. And we know that stress can be an important part of our lives. And just as it is in the game, we can only win if we participate, right? Participation in the game of life means accepting stress and finding ways to manage or achieve our aims. So if you look at the diagram I have on the screen, it'll help us understand how to use CBT skills to assist us in our tug of war. So on my left, I'm trying to think what it looks like on your screens. On my left, it says that it's got like the genetics, the interpersonal conflicts, the stressors that are outside of our control, right? Job loss, etc. And on the right are the coping skills, exposure, relaxation, cognitive therapy, acceptance, problem solving, self-care, etc. And these are the things that we can use and that we need to keep the anxiety from interfering with our ultimate life aims. So another way that we can look at our battle with stress and anxiety is to try to find a balance, a normal desire for protection with a hope of achieving certain life aims. So this can seem like a really abstract concept, to be fair. So let's be really specific. So let's talk about, and I spoke about this earlier, driving a car. So think about it. How often do you drive a car or ride as passenger? Probably daily or close to daily, right? Automobiles have really changed how we live our lives. They're convenient. They help us achieve our life aims quickly and efficiently. And it's probably pretty hard to think about living without them. But of course, driving or riding in a car comes with an assumption of risk. According to the US Department of Transportation, there's a 1 in 84 chance of being killed in an automobile accident. Okay, 1 in 84 at some point in our lives. So why do we take this risk? Why do we assume that risk? It must be worth it to take this chance, right? We take a small risk of getting into an take advantage of the benefits that a car or car travel affords us. Of course, the fact that getting into an accident is relatively unlikely helps, right? So every day we take on risks to reach our life aims, to achieve goals. And while we probably aren't noticing this process, we actually have pros and cons playing out in our head about most of the decisions that we make, but it just happens to happen very rapidly. So if we look at the example on the screen, we look at the cons, small chance of getting hurt or killed, the costs associated with driving, gas, repairs, insurance, and so on. The pros, we get to our destination faster. We accomplish more of our goals each day, hobbies, fun, chores, work, etc. And it increases the number of activities that may be available to us. So our lives really are filled with decisions about when to take risks and when to protect ourselves. And we're usually trying to find a balance between protection and risk. So really what we need to do is try to have as much as we can without increasing the chance of harm too much. So if we look at this as a continuum, right, we can look and see, okay, here's driving with reasonable safety behaviors in place, driving with no concern for safety, or no driving at all. And we can look at those around any kind of circumstance in our lives. There are things that I enjoy, and I won't let anxiety take them from me. It is worth taking that small chance to have some of the things that I want. So if you think about this, say in a social setting, I want to spend time with my friends. Perhaps you have social anxiety. But I'm not going to allow anxiety to take it away from me, and so on. So looking at this example, which is a very concrete example, going for a drive, you can see how this translates into other experiences in our lives. And most people really do try to find that balance between risk and protection. As we're looking at putting it all together, we remember back in our first session, we talked about nature or nurture in the Anxiety 101 section, and we discussed the causes of anxiety. There are many, many factors that can lead to an anxiety problem. But we also know that our vulnerability to anxiety is related to both nature and nurture. So nature is what we inherit from our parents, our genetics. Nurture is our life experience. Risk factors, genetics or experiences that make us more at risk for developing anxiety, are a mixture of these two. So here on the right-hand side of my screen, I think it's the same on yours, are a list of some of the most common risk factors for anxiety. So you have a look at your early life experiences, modeling, traumatic experiences, learned patterns of cognitive inflexibility, patterns of uncertainty. These would be those risk factors in the nurture end of things. And then the genetics would be the inherited vulnerability. What's really hard when it comes to our anxiety is that most of us work hard to maintain some control over our lives, right? We plan, we protect, we organize our lives so they are more predictable and that they feel safer. And while there are some things in our lives that we absolutely can successfully control, there are other things that we simply cannot. In fact, we may find that the more we try to control some things, the more the control eludes us. So one thing that is very, very hard to control completely is our body. Sometimes it can feel as if, we are experiencing a constant influx of pain, anxiety, emotion, thought. The truth about these automatic impulses is that we cannot completely control them, no matter how hard we try. Once a thought comes into our head, it's there. Once an emotion happens, it happens. But as we've learned earlier, trying to get rid of these thoughts, these feelings, can actually make them last longer, can make them grow in their intensity. Our responses to these impulses influences how we experience anxiety in the future. So using the skills that we've kind of built on over the last 4 weeks, we begin to influence our anxiety in a healthy way. So it's for this reason that in CBT, we tend to frame anxiety management as an effort to influence anxiety and build adaptive responses through skill rather than an attempt to control it. As I said, complete control is impossible. You can manage the symptoms, which are likely to pop up from time to time. So if we look at the screen, you get an understanding of the difference. So if you look at influence, my decisions have a part to play in how things turn out. There are some things out of my control versus control. If I work hard enough, I can make things right. I hope nothing bad happens today. That's a control statement. Learning to cope with hardships is a part of life. I can respond well to make it the best case scenario, whatever happens. That would be an influence statement. So adding to our toolbox, let's carrying on problem solving and acceptance. We talked about this briefly, and we're going to have just a quick little chat about this before we move on. When a problem arises, there are many possible responses, right? If you remember the Choose Your Own Adventure books. And as we've discussed throughout these last 4 weeks, some responses to anxieties and problems can help solve it, when others can serve to make things worse. So here are 3 different ways to approach a problem. Problem solving, getting the facts, or accepting what cannot be controlled. One approach may work best, or a combination of all 3. The take-home point here is that all situations are different and they require different approaches to meet your life aims. So if we look at adaptive response number 1, problem solving, we really need to remember that sometimes the best answer to a problem is working it through, right? It's not a problem with our thinking or with our behavior, it's actually a problem with external circumstances. So if you know someone who is consistently aggressive or abusive, we may want to find a way to set firm limits and boundaries with that person or leave the relationship altogether, right? So some of the problem solving skills that we've talked about include exposure skills, assertive communication skills to address interpersonal conflict, taking small steps to progress on long-term projects, planning for the future, managing your time effectively, and so on. If we look at adaptive response number 2, getting the facts, this is a cognitive skill to better understand the facts of a situation. Perhaps there is a problem, perhaps there isn't. So sometimes the first step to understand the facts of a situation and then decide whether or not to use your problem solving skills or accept things that are outside of our control. If we look at adaptive response number 3, this is accepting what we can't control. This is letting go. And there really are times that we want to be able to control something, but our consistent attempts to do so are met with failure, right? And this can make us more frustrated, more angry, more anxious, more depressed. So sometimes choosing, because we always have a choice, choosing to let go of the things we cannot control is absolutely necessary to prevent our problems from getting worse. And by doing this, we let go of some of the burden of failing over and over. So how do we take action? Well, we write down what the problem is. We write it down clearly. We brainstorm ways to solve the problem, even the most ridiculous things, right? All possibilities. We rank the possible solutions from best to worst. How likely is this to work for the approach how likely is this approach to work? Decide on a plan of action for each reasonable solution, and then rate how probable it would be that that would work. After you've done that, pick the most reasonable plan from the ones you've chosen and put it into action. And if it doesn't work, go on to the next best one, and so on. And continue to do this until you have actually solved the problem. So how do you know what to do to make it better? Well, you know, sometimes it's hard to know. It is really difficult to know which approach to take to make a situation better. And while it is ultimately an individual decision, right? What works for me may not work for you. It may take some trial and error. Therapy is a great place to work it out, right? The various skills in CBT are really meant to help us get clarity. Help us get clarity around our decisions, around the problems. And while we don't have the space in this 4-week session to discuss everything in detail about how to make those decisions, this is a great thing to discuss with your individual therapist as you move through treatment for anxiety. So what does that treatment ultimately look like? Well, typically cognitive behavioral therapy has kind of a structure, right? It's evidence-based. It has an impact on anxiety in both the short and the long term. Cognitive behavioral therapy is regular. Typically lasts between 12 and 16 sessions, depending on the problem, and it may take more time or less time. This is just an estimate. It's structured. This is not just a venting session or, you know, just straight talk therapy. There's specific structure to it. You build a variety of skills. It requires practice. It depends on follow-up and follow-through. So this means that you're actually doing the things. CBT is collaborative. It centers around your life aims, and it is evidence-based. It is an evidence-based therapeutic practice. So we have actually hit the end of week 4 of cognitive behavioral therapy skills for anxiety. Questions? I'm going to open it up for the chat. And if you have any questions around what we've covered today or in any of the sessions, please throw it in the chat and we will do our best to answer. And while we're waiting for, oh, there we go, there's a question. Yes, it was a lot of information, Angela, yes, definitely. And so while we're talking about that, I'm just gonna pull this screen up. These are some of the resources that I use. If you're looking for self-help workbooks for anxiety disorders, so they're on the screen, some various workbooks to help. I'll leave that up there for a moment. And then I'm gonna show you some for generalized anxiety disorder. So this is kind of for all anxiety disorders. Right, so Patrina says she has issue in identifying the not taking action as she tends to take action on everything. Right, so that's a really great, you know, point, Patrina, is that sometimes we just want to take action on everything, and learning which things require action and which ones don't is part of that skill set. And I know that you've mentioned that you are working with someone right now, so it'd be a great conversation to have about how do I know when I want to take action? What is appropriate for me? More questions? Interesting but challengeable. Yeah, okay. Very challenging for sure, for sure. Whoops, where on the website do you find the recorded webinars? If you go to the top of the chat box, you can go to Facebook, their Facebook page, but their YouTube channel is youtube.com/channel/ oh golly, I don't even know. Thank you. There it is. There's the link for the recorded webinars. So I mentioned I would bring up the generalized anxiety disorder workbooks. So these are some great sources to help you with generalized anxiety disorder. And I have mentioned in particular the Davis, McKay, and Eshelman book, the Relaxation and Stress Reduction Workbook. That's a really great one. And then the Jeffrey and Brantley workbook, Calming Your Anxious Mind. Both really terrific workbooks that I have used frequently in my own practice. So I'll leave that up for a moment for anybody who would like to jot down any of those. Oh, you're welcome, Colette. Thank you for your participation. I'm just going to leave those there. And so this is our concluding session. So thank you all so much for attending. There are always some great webinars and informational sessions coming from CMHA. They've been a really wonderful community partner and continue to be one. And I think right. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. Excellent. Oh, super. Thank you, Carol. Organize your anxiety. No, I definitely understand that makes sense. Definitely. Thank you, Angela. Time to do the homework, right? Yes, Lisa. Absolutely. Time to do the homework. Other questions? Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all so much. Appreciate your attendance and participation over these last 4 weeks. And I certainly hope to see you on Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. I am on the CMHA of New Brunswick Facebook page doing a Facebook Live. So if you just go to CMHA New Brunswick Facebook page, I'm there each Wednesday morning doing a 15 to 20 minute Facebook Live talking about some coping skills as we move into kind of reopening the province as we move through the pandemic. So again, thank you all so much for your participation, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much. Take care.